Richard McGregor, a China watcher for the London Financial Times, 9 August 2009, commented, quote, "Beijing has managed to pull the Chinese economy out of a ditch with a massive fiscal and monetary stimulus," end quote. Nevertheless, the global economic downturn has sharply worsened conditions for those migrant workers from the countryside who have toiled in factories owned by foreign and offshore Chinese capitalists producing light manufactures for export. Many have had to return to their family villages, at least temporarily, including Uyghurs from Xinjiang, impoverished Uyghurs, and also Han youth in the villages and cities of Xinjiang cannot now improve their conditions by securing employment in the capitalist-owned factories producing for export. In this sense, the basic contradictions of the world capitalist system and the accommodation of that system by Beijing's Stalinist regime have aggravated the national conflict between Uyghurs and Han Chinese in Xinjiang. In their own way, the imperialist bourgeoisies recognize that China continues to embody the social and national gains of the 1949 revolution. The country is not theirs as it was in the past. The ultimate goal of the U.S., European, and Japanese imperialist powers is to restore capitalism in China once again reduce the country to semi-colonial subjugation. In pursuing that goal, the imperialists have encouraged and supported reactionary nationalist forces linked to religion among the Han, non-Han peoples, Tibetans, Uyghurs, in the western borderlands of China. Thus, the national conflict between the Uyghurs and Han in Xinjiang must be viewed within the broad framework of imperialist hostility to the Chinese deformed worker state. Stalinist misrule and the national conflict in Xinjiang. The specific character of the national question in Xinjiang has significantly changed as a consequence of the developments since the 1949 revolution. At that time, 75% of the region's population were Uyghurs, less than 7% were Han Chinese. Today, of the 21 million people in Xinjiang, 45% are Uyghurs and 40% are Han. Moreover, the Han population is concentrated in the cities and even in 1949 made up a majority in Urumqi, the provincial capital. Initially, the migration of Han into the relatively impoverished backwater province of Xinjiang resulted from deliberate government policy and special incentives. However, for the past decade or so, Xinjiang had experienced an economic boom, even by China's standards, centrally based on the exploitation and development of its oil and natural gas fields. According to official figures, the region's gross economic product doubled between 2004 and 2008, from 28 billion to 60 billion. This boom has attracted Han Chinese of all classes, from capitalist entrepreneurs to unskilled laborers, pursuing their own economic interests. That is, the changing demographics are not solely determined by the policy and intent of the CCP regime, though Uyghurs complain that they continue to be excluded even from unskilled work. At the same time, the pervasive use of market relations in the economy and the large private sector have increased the gap between the growing number of Han Chinese and the indigenous peoples in the country's western borderlands, especially in private enterprises, but also in the state sector. Hiring often is based on nepotism, other personal connections, or outright discrimination in favor of Han Chinese. But even if competition in the labor market were decided solely by individual capacity, Han Chinese would still have an advantage over Uyghurs. They are far more skilled and literate, in particular fluent in Mandarin, China's lingua franca. Thus, the past decade's economic boom in Xinjiang appears to have aggravated rather than lessened Uyghur resentment against Han Chinese as a socially privileged and politically dominant nationality. Two China correspondents for London Financial Times, 7 July 2009, report, quote, "The redevelopment of old towns and the influx of richer Han Chinese radically changed local economic structures, costing many Uyghurs their traditional jobs. Quote, "This has happened while Xinjiang's economy has been growing at more than 11% a year for the past 6 years, above the national average. The wealth created by this rapid growth has been concentrated in the pockets of new immigrants, increasing the gap between rich and poor, Han and Uyghur," some locals complain. End quote. Enmity between Uyghurs and Han Chinese has centuries-old historical roots. But that enmity has been intensified by the effects of Stalinist bureaucratic misrule, particularly in the past 2 decades. At the same time, it is important to recognize that Uyghurs, like other workers and rural toilers throughout China, have benefited enormously from the progressive social and economic development of the post-1949 People's Republic. Since the revolution, infant mortality in Xinjiang has continually declined, while life expectancy, less than 30 years in 1949, rose to 67 years by 2000. However, today's young Uyghur men and women are much less likely to compare their conditions of life to those of their parents and grandparents to those of the Han newcomers, and by those standards they are clearly disadvantaged. To be sure, the Stalinist regime has made an effort to recruit more Uyghurs and other national minorities into the higher reaches of the social order. Thus, Uyghur students are given additional points on standardized examinations that are a screening mechanism for admission to university. But such measures have a tokenistic character, given the reality of the mass of Uyghurs are on the bottom of a newly reconfigured society in their own homelands. The Chinese Stalinist leaders, who strive above all to maintain social order, recognize a danger to themselves in the growing hostility of the poorer Uyghurs toward the better-off Han. But instead of moving to raise Uyghur population to the level of the Han within Xinjiang, the CCP regime had to recourse to the safety valve of internal migration to factories and construction sites of coastal China. Beginning in 2002, the government instituted a labor export program for Uyghur youth from low-income families. That program offered substantial advantages for those participating in it. Incomes 2 or 3 times above what they could earn at home, training in modern industrial equipment, Mandarin language classes, and free medical care. But state coercion in the form of stiff fines also used against those Uyghurs who, despite such material incentives, refused to leave their homes to work in strange cities thousands of miles away. An estimated 1.5 million people for Xinjiang, mainly Uyghurs, work elsewhere in China. But that safety valve is now being shut off by the effects of the global capitalist downturn. Reports indicate that both Uyghur and Han perpetrators and victims of last month's riots in Urumqi were mostly unemployed or seasonal migrant workers. What then is to be done? A workers' and peasants' government in China, issuing out of a proletarian political revolution, would establish a rationally planned and centrally managed economy based on the state-owned enterprises. This would not preclude the use of market mechanism for certain purposes, nor a limited role for private, including foreign-owned sectors. Only such a system would be able to narrow the present widening socioeconomic gap between Uyghurs and Han in Xinjiang. What is required is expanding and directing sufficient resources to educate and train Uyghurs in the use of modern industrial technology on the same footing as Han Chinese. In the final analysis, however, to achieve a level of material abundance for the benefit of all of China's people requires the aid from a socialist Japan or a socialist America, underlining again the need for international proletarian revolution. Key to achieving genuine national equality in Xinjiang is reversing the Stalinist policy of forced sinification. In particular, the effort to marginalize the Uyghur language in favor of Mandarin. The CCP boss of Xinjiang Wang Lequan declared that minority languages like Uyghur are out of step with the 21st century.